I call the member Greg Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I rise today to register on behalf of my constituents in Mid Buckinghamshire my outrage at the unacceptable situation that all of my constituents are facing, a tidal wave of energy infrastructure driven by hype, speculation and a closed-minded approach to energy security. Just as we have seen with countless other large-scale infrastructure projects, be it road, rail or indeed housing, it is rural areas that are thrown under the bus with no thought for the huge impact that both construction and operation of these projects has on communities. I would therefore strongly encourage the government to take note of what I believe is a ticking time bomb that risks not just permanently devastating my constituency, but countless others across the United Kingdom. I am sadly no stranger to the problem of big infrastructure. From the moment I was first elected, I have taken every opportunity to put on record the terrible destruction that HS2 has brought on my constituency, from the shameless turfing out of farmers, often leaving them without compensation for years on end, to the sorry state of the roads used by HGVs, and the sheer size of the compounds that litter the Buckinghamshire countryside, literally industrial waste, for there is no justification for spending £200 billion of taxpayers' money on a railway that has effectively already become obsolete. And the same is true of the ground-based energy infrastructure, the least efficient form of energy production. Put simply, the enormous loss of agricultural land required to double today's share of national energy consumption that is generated by solar, amounting to less than 10%, even with this increase proposed, is simply not worth it. It would not be an adjournment debate without... I'm interested to see how my honourable friend gets Mid Buckinghamshire into his intervention, but I'm all ears.
But Mr. Shannon, this is about energy development proposals in Mid Buckinghamshire.
I know it is.
We're ready for your intervention.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman has put forward for Mid Buckinghamshire has put forward the importance of land. The priority for good land, good agricultural land, is to provide the food to feed this nation. It isn't necessary to put forward solar energy projects which then clog and take away the land. My constituency is the same as his, and because of that, my interest is to ensure that the good land is kept for the production of food as it should be.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He is always on point on these matters, and I will come to the very important points of food security later in my speech, but to put on the record in answer directly to him, he is absolutely right, and it is the inefficiency of some of the energy projects we are seeing coming forward in Mid Buckinghamshire, as well as communities, I dare say, in Strangford, that is a huge challenge to not just food security, but the very rural way of life that those of us in communities like Mid Buckinghamshire and I dare say Strangford enjoy. Now, when it takes, Madam Deputy Speaker, 2,000 acres of solar panels to generate enough electricity to power on current usage, before everyone has 2 Teslas on the drive, 50,000 homes of current usage, but a small modular reactor requires just 2 football pitches to produce enough power on current usage for 1 million homes, it cannot be right that the government is pursuing this technology. Nuclear, I would put it to the Minister and honourable and right honourable members across the House, is the answer, but fingers seem to be in ears whenever it is raised. I would have assumed that this is obvious to the government, as would the vital importance of food security, which is directly compromised by taking land out of food production and giving it over to solar. The government seems content with ploughing on. Last week's revelation in the Telegraph of intentions to convert 1/10 of our farmland to use for net zero gives a blank cheque to those intent on destroying rather than preserving our countryside. The countryside is for farming. It is not a building site for solar panels or power plants or battery storage or wind turbines. It is for growing food. It is for the local communities and businesses that rely on it. And the attempts to take away land from food production in my constituency are simply unjustifiable. An unjustifiable 3,000 acres of land already lost or is at risk of being subsumed by solar panels. 3,000 acres being taken out of food production. 3,000 acres that is no longer farmed by families who farmed it for generations, now turfed out with little or no compensation. The land unlikely ever to return to food production. And keep in mind, Madam Deputy Speaker, that that is just for the current projects proposed or consented. Take Rosefield, a monster project of immense scale. Over 2,000 acres of land for this monstrosity alone, much of it arable grade 3A, 3B, being sold off to EDF Renewables for the construction of vast swathes of solar panels right in the heart of the Claydons. Land that regularly produces a 10-tonne a hectare wheat harvest. That is a wheat harvest that many farmers would bite your right hand off to actually get, but it is cast aside by the consultants and the people that come along trying to propose this site as low-grade land. It simply is not. As the name suggests, this area is rich in clay soil, incredibly valuable to farmers as it retains rich levels of both nutrients and water. It's what allows us in Buckinghamshire to produce immense quantities of wheat, barley, beans and oilseed rape and much, much more. Yet we're facing a clear trade-off between food security and what is considered today to be energy security. Members will know that I've consistently questioned the suitability and sustainability of solar as a renewable source of electricity. There is nothing renewable about land left to rot underneath solar panels. There is nothing renewable about the huge amount of emissions used in the construction of these vast sites. We in Buckinghamshire face an equal, if not greater, threat from what are called battery energy storage sites. These shipping container-sized units use hundreds of lithium-ion batteries to store surplus energy, which is later sold back to the grid to meet demand when required. These battery storage sites are not only noisy and unsightly, they displace water runoff because of their concrete bases. They create light pollution, they are a target for vandalism, and they are a huge fire risk, which I will come on to shortly. And on top of all of that, these are, I'm afraid to say, not a sustainable form of energy production, because these sites are doing nothing more than holding surplus energy, no matter how or where that energy has actually been generated. In fact, with less than 5% of today's energy consumption coming from solar, chances are this energy has not come from the site next door. It is utterly shameful of BESS promoters to label their projects as sustainable and part of the solution. I'm afraid to say it is simply a matter of profiteering off the taxpayer while doing little to nothing. That is, unless you enjoy a chemically fueled bonfire, because it has been proven time and time again with tragic results how dangerous BESSs can be. For example, in September 2020, a fire at a BESS site in Liverpool took 59 hours to extinguish. And whilst the promoters may spout new technology guarding us against fire today, this does not and cannot justify placing BESSs in rural areas. Because, surprise, surprise, it takes far longer for fire crews to respond in rural areas, especially ones that are prone to flooding, such as the Claydons in my constituency, where three BESS applications have been lodged in just 1 year. It's not surprising that pouring concrete onto farmland exacerbates flooding. It is not surprising that hundreds of shipping containers ruin the view from miles around.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I'd be delighted to give way.
Joe Morrissey.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. Not only do these energy development proposals create a strain on our valuable farmland in Mid Buckinghamshire and across Buckinghamshire, but equally we are in a floodplain in many parts of Buckinghamshire, which will already be put under additional strain because of these different energy development proposals. And do you think the minister look again at these proposals, because we also have infrastructure demands for both HS2, housing and energy development, all going into a very constrained area in Mid Buckinghamshire?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm grateful to my honourable friend and fellow Buckinghamshire Member of Parliament for that intervention, and she is absolutely right that the strain being put on our small rural county from so many projects, the cumulative impact of the energy proposals that is the subject of my speech tonight, but also HS2 and East-West Rail and mega prisons and so much more, makes the attack on our countryside and makes the risk, particularly to the point she makes on flooding, all the worse. I just gave a list of things that should not be surprising, but it does seem surprising to promoters who seem totally oblivious to the idea that farming gives us food, gives people jobs and a livelihood, gives communities an identity and a vital source of income. But that seemingly hasn't stopped those promoters from flooding the planning system in Mid Buckinghamshire with these BESS applications. And what makes it all the more confusing is, according to the government's newly formed National Energy Systems Operator, the number of speculative connection applications has substantially risen over the past few years, resulting in an excessively high volume of contracted parties, when in reality only about a third of the volume of those projects will make it to completion. So what we actually see, and the point I'm making, which is very visible in Mid Buckinghamshire, is a number of these so-called zombie projects that are clogging up the system, causing incredible concern and outrage to local communities that may actually never happen. And that, I would say, Madam Deputy Speaker, is simply absurd. My constituents are constantly being told that these projects are needed for a transition to net zero, yet the vast majority of them will not even be completed. This goes to show how misguided the government's so-called energy security policy really is, unable to deliver and throwing my constituents under the bus in the first place. It should therefore not be a surprise that the misguided and highly speculative nature of these BESS projects has led to countless rejections by local planning authorities. Less than 6 weeks ago, when presented with their first BESS application, a 500 megawatt site in the Claydons, Buckinghamshire Council resoundingly rejected it on the grounds of fire risk, lack of access and an inappropriate site location. Our local paper even described the plan as a terrorist's dream. The same goes for York Council, which rejected a 100 megawatt site in the village of Osbaldwick on fire grounds, which for the same reason led East Renfrewshire Council rejecting a 40 megawatt site in the village of Eaglesham in Scotland, and for Dorset Council's rejection of a 60 megawatt facility in the village of Chickerell. I trust the Minister shall have taken notice of not just these rejections, but the many others which are, if anything, increasing by the week. This, I hope, demonstrates the clear, strong opposition from local communities to these BESS facilities. But it is not just, Madam Deputy Speaker, about battery storage or solar farms or substations or whatever else forms part of the government's flawed approach to energy security. For constituencies like mine, it's about the cumulative impact of all of this and more, which time and time again the local community has little, if any, say over at all. For my constituents, again in the Claydons, nearly every major project has been government sanctioned, with little to no thought as to how, when you combine one of the largest solar installations in the United Kingdom, 3 battery storage sites, 2 major new railways, a new substation and several new housing developments, a collection of small villages in the middle of the countryside is meant to cope. The short answer is they haven't. Initially faced with both East-West Rail and HS2 construction, the latter still ongoing and will do so for many years to come, my constituents in that part of Buckinghamshire now face a raft of new energy infrastructure as well as yet more housing and a new prison. The cumulative impact really is devastating, made worse by the fact that there is no mechanism within the planning system that allows cumulative impact of major multiple infrastructure projects in the same area to be accounted for when local authorities are presented with them. It seems logical, yet the Minister must recognise there is no circumstance which necessitates the flattening of an area that serves no benefit for local residents to leave them in a near permanent state of disruption and misery. The latest example of this glaring omission is the application and subsequent rejection of Statera's plan to build a 500 megawatt BESS facility in the Claydons that I spoke of a few moments ago. It turns out that the promoters didn't check that they could even get a grid connection upon completion, as confirmed by the National Grid when pressed on that substation expansion plan before Christmas. This is yet more evidence of the speculative nature of government-backed infrastructure projects. Just as well with Statera's plans having now been rejected. Elsewhere in my constituency, yet another solar installation at Callis Farm in Ilmer, Callis Farm near Ilmer, was recently granted planning permission, joining two other nearby sites at Bumpers Farm and Wilbrush Farm in Kingsey. As a result, when you enter Buckinghamshire on the train from neighbouring Oxfordshire, you are met not with farmland, but with acres upon acres of solar panels. Further south and directly affecting my constituents in Little Missenden, we find yet another potential BESS site at Mop End, which if built would require infrastructure reaching 6 metres in height, right in the heart of the Chilterns. In Long Crendon and the surrounding villages, I and the local community are fighting against Acorn Bioenergy's proposed anaerobic digester, which once again cannot be justified in the middle of the countryside, not when there are 140 lorry movements a day during construction and then through operation, through villages that, and I will declare an interest, my own village of Cheersley is included amongst that, simply cannot cope and cannot be expected to cope. Small rural villages where those small rural roads often have the front doors to people's homes, the entranceways to primary schools, the entranceways to children's playgrounds, right off those very same roads. I will give way briefly to my honourable friend.
My honourable friend is making a very excellent point about the shocking amount of development that is happening, and it's not just energy, but my honourable friend is making an excellent point about the lack of local consent, and it is shocking that the government is not honouring the opinions of local people.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She makes exactly the point that I want to make, perhaps more succinctly than I have been able to manage, that this is about local consent. This is about communities giving their views and actually being listened to when it comes to these projects, because far too often the desktop exercise that is done in London or Birmingham or Leeds or Manchester or any of our great cities is largely done by those that have no or little understanding of rural life, of the way our rural roads actually operate, the way our farmland is actually farmed, the way our countryside actually works. And if local people were listened to a little bit more often, we might not have some of the problems that these energy infrastructure projects, or otherwise like HS2 or East West Rail, throw up. The land that any local will tell you floods 3 or 4 times a year, but the desktop exercise says, oh, that's nothing, that's nowhere near a floodplain. That land won't flood. But I've stood there in my own Wellington boots a number of times on many of these sites, and the land that the consultants in the cities say won't flood, with it lapping up at the top of my boots and going home with wet socks. It is a reality that local people often understand in a way that these consultants and desktop exercises never would. And I gently invite the Minister to acknowledge that no matter how sustainable these projects claim to be, the hard truth is that whether it be during construction or operation of these sites, transportation of materials effectively offsets any benefit and does permanent damage to a local area, just as it has done with HS2. Just this week, I've objected to yet another BSS application in the Claydons where the developer has not even bothered to include a battery safety management plan. It is utterly disgraceful and a reflection of just how speculative these applications are becoming. Despite this speculation on solar and battery storage, wherever you go in Buckinghamshire, there are few, if any, warehouse roofs with solar panels. A real shame considering the amount of unused roof space which could generate 15 gigawatts of solar-derived energy without damaging a blade of grass or any crop growing in any field. This is equivalent to 46 million solar panels. Why, therefore, is the government not actively incentivising the use of large-scale roof-mounted solar, particularly on industrial buildings, these distribution centres and warehouses and factories that we see popping up all around us, certainly near to me as you go out towards Bicester or up towards Milton Keynes? A question that is rightly asked by farmers across my constituency who stand to lose everything when a solar developer comes along, or indeed any energy project with little or no compensation. This is, I'm afraid to say, fairly typical at this point when it comes to infrastructure, especially in rural areas where a farm is not just a source of income, but someone's livelihood and the very shape and beauty of the landscape in rural communities. And when it comes to a project the size of Rosefield, which primarily affects tenant farmers, the loss of income, not just for individual farmers, but the whole area, is devastating. That's because, unlike a freeholder, in this case, the Claydon estate, tenant farmers do not have ownership rights and are therefore not entitled to proper compensation. This is despite this and other sizable projects being spearheaded by large multinational energy companies for whom compensation is normally just a rounding error. And it's not just farmers. Unpaid parish councillors across my constituency are spending ever more time fighting this infrastructure tidal wave. I dare say many have become rather good at it, following years of doing battle with HS2. But this by no means justifies thousands of hours each year being spent by countless individuals, countless heroes, sometimes combined with significant sums of money, fighting projects that local residents don't want and did not ask for. They, along with farmers and local business owners, are paying the price for this nonsensical approach to energy security. And for projects that are given the go-ahead, there is little chance of promoters paying up for the damage they will invariably do to our local road network. This is a sad reality for infrastructure projects, as we have seen with the countless others I have referenced, though I am proud the work I and Buckinghamshire Council did to push East West Rail to pay up for the damage they caused. There is no such prospect with energy infrastructure. But the fact is, with so many sites in one area, the impact on our roads from all that construction traffic would be far worse than any one promoter is prepared to admit. So much of that, just as we have seen with those railways and highways works clash, it delays all projects in the area, ultimately costing the taxpayer and prolonging the misery for my constituents. This is the reality. And if something isn't done, we will lose our ability to produce food. We will see the continued erosion of rural communities, all while doing little to source our energy sustainability. Energy infrastructure does not belong on farmland. It does not belong in Mid Buckinghamshire. Let's drop this nonsense and go for nuclear instead.